Why is our country in this position, Piers? Why is it that tens of thousands of people, in fact hundreds of thousands sometimes, were shutting down the centre of London week in, week out, something, by the way, the French government wouldn't allow in Paris, but was happening week in, week out, with people being intimidated on the streets of London and other cities, with anti-Semitic and racist abuse from these marchers every single week, all the time. Nobody in government just sort of said, look, okay, we get the point, right, but you don't have the right to intimidate people. Why do we have people outside Westminster Abbey calling out jihadist chants? Why do we have people on the streets of London who some of them I've seen you countering on your show, calling for jihad on the streets of London? Why did the man who wrote the book justifying and calling for the murder of a British novelist, why is he living in London? Still cannot understand how a society can be so insane that it can welcome in people who want to destroy it. But Labour, Conservative, the Liberal Democrats, all in government, promised to bring down net migration and to stop illegal migration, and instead they ramped it up and ramped it up and ramped it up.
When you say things like the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians, or the public will have to sort this out themselves, do you see that there is a peril there in somebody like you with a big following appearing to advocate mob rule?
Something big is brewing in the UK. The nation stands at a crossroads, with tensions rising and uncertainty looming. And now British intellectual Douglas Murray warns, change is imminent, and it could reshape the country as we know it. What's coming? Is the UK ready for what lies ahead?
We should have a threat of hundreds of thousands of people who hate Britain, who never, ever carry a British flag, would never, ever do anything that is patriotic for Britain.
Stay with us as we unpack what's next for Britain and why you need to pay attention. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve on the most critical issues shaping the future, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an update.
You got dragged into this for comments you said not while it was going on, but last year in an interview with the former Australian Deputy Prime Minister. We've got the clip which caused all the problems for you. Let's play this.
I think I know that the British soul is awakening and stirring with rage at what these people are doing. These people came into our house. Many of them broke into our house illegally. Many of them were never wanted here. I don't want them to live here. I don't want them here. In the UK, it's different. Our police force behave differently, and policing by consent and all of these sorts of things. But clearly they've lost control of the streets. Now, is it time to send in the army at some point? Probably yes. But if the army will not be sent in, then the public will have to go in, and the public will have to sort this out themselves. And it'll be very, very brutal.
Now, this was deliberately put back out to try and cancel you. And a lot of people, Alistair Campbell, a lot of the usual suspects, Mehdi Hassan and others, wanted you cancelled for these outrageously inflammatory remarks, which were not said while these riots were happening. Just to clarify, who were you talking about in that interview?
It's very clear. It was actually after October 7th. I said, why are we in Britain so stupid that we allowed people like former Hamas military commander in the West Bank to live in London? Why? What did we in Britain get out of allowing terrorists to live in our midst? Why is the former Deputy Prime Minister of Iran, who wrote the book justifying the murder of the British novelist Salman Rushdie, why did the man who wrote the book justifying and calling for the murder of a British novelist, why is he living in London? Why has he been living in London for the last 20 years? What has Britain got out of this? Why are we so crazy in Britain that we would give sanctuary to people who want our way of life over? And I've still never had a response to that question. I've asked it for many years, and I've written extensively about it, and I still cannot understand how a society can be so insane that it can welcome in people who want to destroy it. But
Douglas Murray's comments reflect his strong stance on immigration and the presence of individuals in the UK whom he believes pose a threat to British society. He questions why the country has allowed people with extremist views or connections to reside within its borders, expressing frustration over what he sees as the UK's failure to protect its own citizens and values. While some may see his views as a legitimate critique of national security policies, others have criticized his remarks as inflammatory and potentially harmful, particularly in how they may contribute to social tensions.
Let's park that for a second. The situation in Southport is, as you say, it's a very interesting example of what can happen with social media. I don't care about these agitators like the people you mentioned, let alone Alistair Campbell, who's a fascinating man in the projection that he is able.
I completely agree.
To do. It's extraordinary. He's a very bizarre man. I mean, the idea that we need to listen to Alistair Campbell talking about truth in public life is kind of preposterous to me and anyone else with a long-term memory. But anyway, I don't care about these people. They just go around behaving as bullies and then as victims. It's amazing. But the Southport thing is extremely important to linger on for a moment, because actually it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. Southport was such a heinous crime in an area where, I mean, unfortunately, we've got sort of used to terrorist attacks in some of our major cities. But an appalling, brutal attack like this on the weakest and most vulnerable target is something which so horrifies people that, of course, they scour around looking for people to blame. Now, we'll see when the trial comes up, if there were any motivations or, as it were, inspirations for this vile young man who did this. But I have to say, having covered a lot of terrorist incidents in my life, one of the things that anyone who's wise knows is just wait, and see who is responsible before you start sounding off.
Douglas reflects on the Southport crime, emphasizing the shock and horror it caused due to its brutal nature and the vulnerability of the victims. He notes that while terrorist attacks have sadly become more common in major cities, this particular event struck a deep chord, leading people to quickly search for those to blame. Murray stresses the importance of restraint in such situations, advocating for waiting until all facts are clear before drawing conclusions or attributing motives.
And unfortunately, there's lots of people who don't have the discipline to do that. Some people who, in the immediate aftermath of something, are just, as I say, scouring for people to blame. I think that there are several lessons to be taken from this, though. One is, we cannot be in a situation in our society, in Britain or anywhere else, where we are only one madman's attack from responses like this happening. I have argued for decades now that if we had a sensible asylum policy and a reasonable immigration policy, and we didn't allow thousands of people to come into the country illegally every few months, that we could have a reasonable kind of migration policy like we had in the 1990s, when tens of thousands of people were net migration a year. We don't have that situation in Britain now. We do have thousands of people coming illegally all the time and never being returned. And we had net migration of almost 750,000 in the last year of a Conservative government that had promised in election after election to bring immigration, net legal migration, down to 1990s levels. And they didn't. Labour, Conservative, the Liberal Democrats, all in government, promised to bring down net migration and to stop illegal migration, and instead they ramped it up and ramped it up and ramped it up. The consequences of that are totally predictable. When people say now that my book, The Strange Death of Europe, was prophetic, I say it wasn't prophetic. You didn't need to be a prophet to see the loss of trust in society, the scouring around for people to blame, the much more. You didn't need to be a prophet to see that. You just had to have your eyes open and be willing to say what you saw with them.
The current immigration and asylum policies in the UK are unsustainable and have led to a loss of trust within society. He criticizes both Conservative and Liberal governments for failing to reduce net migration and curb illegal immigration despite repeated promises. Murray believes that the increasing number of people entering the country illegally has created predictable social tensions, and he points to tragic incidents like the Southport attack as a reminder of the broader consequences.
And too few people were willing to do that. And when you have a situation like Southport, it reminds you that the situation which our politicians have created in Britain is such that you are only one madman's behaviour away from having significant civil unrest. And the problem for the Starmer government is they resurrected the EDL, that, as I understand, has not existed as an organisation for 10 years, and they've been desperately trying to say that these were coordinated and people were coordinated. And that was, by the way, why I got sort of dragged into this madness, was because people were desperate to have people they could say were responsible for the terrible outrages that happened in communities across the north of England, including, by the way, Muslim gangs of Muslim men caught on camera, some of them with weapons, some of whom, by the way, were being advised by a policeman to leave the weapons in the mosque so that they didn't get into trouble. And that's an amazing thing to see, but again, kind of to be expected. But what is it about our society that people were looking for people who they could say had coordinated this? I would say it's much worse than that. Would that there were clear coordinators here, because you could go after the people. But there weren't, Piers. As I understand it, from what I can see, this was angry crowds of people that sometimes became mobs, and they weren't coordinated. That is much harder and much more worrying, because it...
Well, I would take slight issue. Okay.
Douglas expresses concern about the potential for civil unrest in the UK, particularly in response to isolated violent incidents. He critiques the handling of such events, including the portrayal of groups like the English Defence League and the behaviour of some communities involved in the unrest. Murray highlights what he sees as a lack of coordination behind these incidents, suggesting that spontaneous anger from unorganized crowds is more alarming and harder to manage than coordinated actions. While some may view his assessment as a valid critique of social instability, others could argue that it risks inflaming tensions by focusing on divisive narratives.
Why is our country in this position, Piers? Why is it that tens of thousands of people, in fact hundreds of thousands sometimes, were shutting down the centre of London week in, week out, something, by the way, the French government wouldn't allow in Paris, but was happening week in, week out, with people being intimidated on the streets of London and other cities, with anti-Semitic and racist abuse from these marchers every single week, all the time? Nobody in government just sort of said, look, okay, we get the point. You don't have the right to intimidate people. Why do we have people outside Westminster Abbey calling out jihadist chants? Why do we have people on the streets of London some of whom I've seen you countering on your show, calling for jihad on the streets of London? Why are we in this position that on the 11th of November, on the day that is most sacred to the British soul, where we remember our forebears who fought for our freedom, that we should have a threat of hundreds of thousands of people who hate Britain, who never ever carry a British flag, would never ever do anything that is patriotic for Britain? Why are we in this situation in Britain? I would tell you why. Again, it's because our government has lost control of the borders for years, and now we are a very low trust, very febrile society in Britain, where we used to be very high trust, and where we didn't used to be at risk of having riots at any moment because of one madman anywhere in the country.
The UK is facing a crisis of social cohesion, attributing it to years of ineffective immigration policies and the government's loss of control over its borders. He points to large protests in London, some involving anti-Semitic and extremist rhetoric, as evidence of growing unrest and divisions within society. Murray expresses concern over the erosion of national trust and the rise of a fear society, contrasting it with a time when Britain, in his view, was more unified and peaceful. While he blames successive governments for these issues, others might argue that his portrayal oversimplifies complex social and political dynamics and could exacerbate existing tensions.
We're in this situation because generations of politicians of all parties have brought us here. That is on them. But my question is always, why has it got to be always a one-way street on the toleration? We are forever being told about how tolerant we have to be. But it seems to me that the people saying that are highly intolerant of us and our traditions. The reason why the cenotaph matters is because it is a holy place in the British psyche. The reason why the statue of Churchill, which is always being attacked, is so sacred to us is because it speaks to the sacrifice of our forebears and the knowledge that we in Britain are a good country, who have been a force for good in the world, overwhelmingly, and that we have people in our country now who do not believe in that, who believe we have been a force for evil in the world, who march against our country, who threaten to despoil our holy places and our very identity. The British public should not endlessly be putting up with being insulted and defamed. And my belief is that we have the right to stand up for our traditions and a right to stand up for our holy places and our holy days. And that the situation we're in is that if anyone does say we must, if people are going to threaten to attack the cenotaph, we should defend it, people will say the people who defend it are far-right extremists. By the way, something they would never say against the people, the other way around, who would deface the cenotaph. So, we have been transformed as a society into an incredibly febrile, low-trust society. And as Nadim Sahawi said in the Times the other week, he wrote a piece where he mentioned me, and he said that Douglas Murray has said for years that what is now happening would happen. And as he said, I never did it in the spirit of glee. I did it in deep lamentation. I did it in deep lamentation because I could see what was being done to Britain and the British people.
Douglas expresses concern about what he sees as a growing intolerance toward British traditions and values, particularly about the nation's historical symbols and institutions, such as the cenotaph and the statue of Winston Churchill. He argues that while British society is repeatedly urged to be tolerant, there is a double standard, with critics of British history and identity being less tolerant of the nation's cultural heritage. Murray believes that the public has the right to defend these symbols and that the current political climate has contributed to a loss of trust and increased societal division. While his views resonate with those who feel strongly about protecting national identity, others may see his perspective as overlooking the complexities of a diverse and evolving society.
And I warned against it, and Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrats, SNP and others all just merrily went along the way of making our society something different. I never wanted that. I don't think the British people wanted that. We never voted for that. When we were asked whether we wanted it, we said no. And they didn't listen. So we'll see what happens in the years ahead. And we'll see if Starmer and co have any idea of how to solve the problems that generations of politicians have caused in Britain. But no, I did not want to be in a society in Britain where we have jihadists living in our midst, where we have terrorists that we welcome in, where we give every advantage to people who hate us, or at the very least do not like us. I never wanted that to be the case. I'm extremely sad that it is the case. I'd love to see it turned around. I know how it could happen. I have very low belief that we have anyone in charge in Britain who knows what to do about this. But it's a problem they've brought on our society, and I profoundly wish that they had not.
Douglas concludes by expressing deep frustration with the political decisions that, in his view, have changed British society in ways that the public did not support. He criticizes successive governments for ignoring public sentiment on issues like immigration and national security, particularly in allowing individuals with extremist views to live in the UK. Murray expresses sadness over the current state of the country and doubts that current political leaders, including Keir Starmer, have the solutions to these challenges. In this video, Douglas Murray delivers a sharp critique of the UK's immigration policies and political leadership, expressing concern over social tensions, national security, and the erosion of British traditions. He argues that ineffective policies and government inaction have led to a breakdown in trust and social cohesion, with protests, unrest, and a lack of respect for national symbols reflecting deeper societal divides. While some view his stance as a legitimate call for stronger national identity and security, others see it as overly alarmist and potentially divisive in an already complex and diverse society.